My name is Maya Thompson, and for 4 years I ran my family's logistics company without taking a single day off. Not weekends, not holidays. Not even when my body begged me to stop. I was paid just enough to survive, never enough to match the responsibility I carried. So when I finally graduated with my master's degree earned at night, after 14-hour workdays, I did what I thought was reasonable. I asked my father for a raise. He didn't look at my numbers. He didn't ask about my workload. He just smiled and said, "You're lucky to have this job." 48 hours later, he called an all-hands meeting and proudly announced my younger sister, Bree, as the new director of client experience and growth. Her salary was triple mine. Company car. Paid phone. I stood there frozen, realizing this wasn't a business decision. It was punishment for daring to know my worth. I resigned quietly. 1 week later, a competitor called and said, "We've been watching how Thompson Logistics runs. Everyone says that was you." They offered me 45% more. I didn't take revenge by yelling. I took it by disappearing the moment they needed me most. If you were in my place, what would you have done, and where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? I didn't walk into Thompson Logistics with illusions of a corner office or special treatment just because my last name was on the trucks. When I graduated from college, I showed up like any other new hire, steel-toe boots, hair tied back, coffee in one hand, and a clipboard in the other. My first weeks weren't spent in meetings. They were spent in the warehouse at 4 or 5 in the morning, learning how cases were stacked, how cables were wrapped so they didn't kink, how lighting rigs could crack if you rushed them onto a truck. I rode along on site calls, lifted crates until my arms shook, and learned what show day really meant, how everything that looked effortless to a client was actually the result of dozens of tiny decisions made under pressure, usually in the dark, usually before anyone else was awake. I wanted to understand the work from the ground up, because I'd already learned one thing growing up in this family: no one respected you unless you proved yourself useful. I stayed because my father promised me a future that sounded reasonable at the time. He said if I learned the business inside and out, if I stuck it out through the ugly parts, I'd move into a real leadership role, COO, maybe even partial ownership someday. Not as a handout, he insisted, but as something I'd earn. At the same time, my mother's health wasn't great back then. Nothing dramatic, nothing people brought casseroles for, just enough medical appointments and quiet worry to make stability feel important. I told myself staying was the responsible choice. The adult choice. The kind of decision people praised from the outside. And if I'm being honest, I also wanted my parents' approval in a way I didn't yet know how to admit. I thought if I worked hard enough, long enough, they would eventually see me the way I wanted to be seen. The contrast between how my sister and I were treated had always been there, but when we were younger, I brushed it off as personality differences. Bree was the charming one, the social one, the daughter who lit up a room. When she turned 16, she got a new car. I shared my mother's old one and paid for my own gas. Bree's college years were described as finding herself. Mine were described as being practical. When she switched majors or jobs, my parents called it exploration. When I worked through weekends, they called it expected. By the time we were adults, the pattern had hardened into something unspoken but deeply understood. Bree was loved for who she was. I was valued for what I did. Money made that difference impossible to ignore. I paid my student loans every month, watched my balance crawl down one painful payment at a time, and learned how to budget in ways Bree never had to. My parents helped her with rent when she moved apartments, waived off her credit card debt as temporary, and spoke proudly about her potential. Meanwhile, I was told I was lucky to have steady work, lucky to be learning the business, lucky not to complain. I didn't resent Bree for it at first. I resented myself for noticing. I convinced myself that being the reliable one meant something, that being indispensable would eventually turn into being respected. As the company grew, I started to see how fragile that belief was. My father was excellent at relationships, handshakes, lunches, stories about how long he'd known someone. Clients liked him. But the day-to-day reality of keeping jobs on schedule, crews coordinated, equipment accounted for, and mistakes from turning into lawsuits fell on a small group of people who rarely appeared in those conversations. I was one of them. There were a few others too, people who knew which client hated delays, which crew worked best under pressure, which shortcuts always came back to haunt you. Slowly, quietly, the company began to run on that knowledge. And just as quietly, I realized how easily it could fall apart without it. That realization should have scared me into leaving earlier. Instead, it trapped me deeper. When you're the person everyone turns to when something breaks, you start believing that walking away would be selfish. My father leaned into that without ever saying it outright. "We need you," he'd say during crises. "You're the only one who understands this." Each time, it felt like trust. It felt like importance. What it really was, I would learn later, was a leash disguised as praise. By the end of my first year, I wasn't just helping anymore. I was coordinating. By the end of my second, I was fixing problems before they reached my father's desk. By the third, people came to me automatically, not because of my title, but because I made things work. And still, when my sister stumbled through job after job, the family narrative stayed the same. She just needed time. She just hadn't found the right fit. I, on the other hand, was doing exactly what I was supposed to do. So no one asked if it was costing me anything. Looking back now, I can see how carefully the trap was built. Family loyalty. Promises of a future just far enough away to keep me patient. The subtle guilt of being the strong one. I didn't stay because I was naive. I stayed because I was taught, slowly and convincingly, that my value came from endurance. And once you believe that, walking away doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like betrayal. By the time I realized I wasn't just helping anymore, but actually running operations, the problems had already piled up high enough to hurt the business. Crews were being dispatched based on whoever answered the phone first. Trucks left the warehouse half-loaded or overloaded because no one had a clear picture of what equipment was already out on another job. Lighting kits went missing for weeks and then reappeared damaged, with no record of where they'd been. We missed deadlines, not because the work was impossible, but because the same mistakes kept repeating: wrong gear on site, the wrong crew assigned, or trucks zigzagging across the state, because routes were planned on gut feeling instead of logic. Clients were polite but frustrated, and the fines for late setups or extended teardowns were quietly eating into our margins. Everyone felt the chaos, but no one owned it, because owning it meant fixing it. So I did what I'd always done. I started mapping the mess. I spent nights and weekends walking through the warehouse with a notebook, listing every piece of equipment we owned, where it should live, and how often it actually moved. I pushed for an inventory system that used barcodes instead of memory. Every booth frame, lighting rig, cable set, and truss got tagged. Nothing left the building without being scanned, and nothing came back without being checked in. At first, people complained. It felt slower. It felt unnecessary. Then we stopped losing gear. We stopped double booking equipment we didn't actually have. We stopped paying rush fees to replace things that had been sitting on the wrong truck all along. What used to be a guessing game became data. Routing was the next battlefield. We were burning money sending trucks back and forth across counties because jobs were scheduled independently of geography. I built load plans based on routes, not habits. Trucks heading north, loaded for every northern site that day. Crews were assigned based on both skill and proximity. Fuel costs dropped. Overtime dropped. Setups started finishing on time because people weren't arriving exhausted after 3 unnecessary hours on the road. I replaced paper schedules taped to office walls with scheduling software that let us see, in real time, who was where, what they had, and what they were qualified to handle. For the first time, we could plan more than a day ahead without crossing our fingers. Safety was the part no one wanted to talk about until something went wrong. Before I stepped in, training was informal and equipment was replaced only after it broke. I implemented mandatory safety briefings, standardized checklists, and real training for rigging and electrical work. We upgraded gear instead of buying the cheapest replacements. Accidents didn't disappear entirely, but near misses stopped becoming incidents. Insurance premiums stabilized. Crews trusted that management cared whether they went home in one piece. That trust showed up in how they worked. The changes didn't feel dramatic day to day, but the numbers told the story. Late penalties disappeared. Client complaints dropped. We started finishing jobs with breathing room instead of panic. That breathing room gave us space to grow. Within a year, revenue climbed past 8 million. The next year, it broke 10. By the time my fourth year rolled around, we were consistently landing between 12 and 13 million annually. We won a long-term contract with a major convention center because we could demonstrate reliability, not just promise it. A regional hotel chain followed, then 2 universities that wanted multi-year agreements because we could handle complexity without falling apart. Those weren't lucky breaks. They were the direct result of systems that worked. Through all of it, my title barely changed. My responsibilities ballooned, my hours stretched. My pay did not. I received small adjustments that kept me comfortable, but never bonuses tied to performance, never profit sharing, never equity. Each time I brought it up, the answer was the same: we'd talk later, once things were more stable, once the next milestone passed. Stability became a moving target. Success became something I delivered, not something I shared in. What stung wasn't just the money. It was the quiet way my contributions were absorbed into the family narrative without ever being named. When clients praised our turnaround, my father accepted the compliments. When contracts renewed, it was proof of his relationships. When things ran smoothly, that was just how the company worked now. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was building something bigger than a paycheck. I told myself patience was part of leadership. But there's a difference between patience and erasure, and I was slowly learning which one I was being asked to practice. The company everyone saw from the outside, the polished presentations, the confident promises, was held together by processes I designed and people I'd trained. A small group of us knew exactly how thin that line was. We also knew who was carrying the weight of it. And even then, even with all that evidence in front of me, I stayed. Because when you've been taught that your worth comes from making things work, you don't stop when they finally do. You keep going, waiting for the moment someone looks at you and says, "We couldn't have done this without you." Success has a way of hiding its cost when you're inside it. From the outside, Thomson Logistics looked like a company on the rise. From inside my body, it felt like a slow erosion. There was no single dramatic breaking point at first, just a steady series of moments where work quietly replaced everything else. Christmas dinner was one of them. We were halfway through eating when my phone started vibrating on the table. One of the trucks was stuck on the interstate after an accident up ahead, and the backup crew I'd scheduled had called out sick. I remember my fork hovering in the air while my parents kept talking, pretending not to notice. I stood up, walked into the hallway, and spent 40 minutes rerouting equipment, calling favors, and recalculating a setup timeline while the food went cold behind me. When I came back, my mother smiled and said, "At least you fixed it," like that was the point of the evening. Moments like that stacked up until they became my normal. I missed my boyfriend's birthday because a last-minute client change required a full equipment swap overnight. I promised I'd make it up to him, then canceled again when a venue double-booked us and blamed our crew. I RSVP'd yes to my best friend's wedding months in advance, bought a dress, booked a hotel, and still ended up calling her the night before to say I couldn't come. There was an emergency install at a hotel that morning, and no one else knew how to handle the client. When I told my mom how awful I felt, she didn't hesitate. "You're strong," she said. "You can handle more than most people. Just a little sacrifice." As if sacrifice had an end point I'd already passed without noticing. Somewhere in the middle of all that, I decided to enroll in a master's program. It sounds irrational now, adding more weight to a load that was already crushing me, but at the time it felt like the logical next step. If knowledge was power, I told myself, then more knowledge would finally shift the balance. I chose a program focused on operations and supply chain management, something directly relevant to the business. Classes were at night. I logged into lectures after 12-hour workdays, my laptop balanced on the same desk where I'd been reviewing schedules and invoices hours earlier. I studied on weekends in the warehouse office, while crews loaded trucks around me. I wrote papers about optimization and risk management, then applied those theories the next morning before most people had finished their coffee. Part of me genuinely loved the learning. Another part hoped, quietly and stubbornly, that this would be the thing my family couldn't ignore. The exhaustion crept in slowly, then all at once. I started waking up with a knot in my stomach that coffee only made worse. I told myself it was stress, that everyone felt this way sometimes. I kept antacids in my bag and learned which meals were least likely to make the pain flare during site visits. One afternoon, while checking equipment returns in the warehouse, my vision narrowed without warning. The room tilted. I caught myself on a shelving unit and slid down until I was sitting on the concrete floor, heart racing, ears ringing. A crew member asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine. I always said I was fine. Later that week, a doctor told me I wasn't. He talked about ulcers, about burnout, about the need for rest, like it was a prescription I could actually fill. He suggested time off. I nodded and didn't tell him that I hadn't taken a real day off in 4 years. Rest felt impossible. Not because no one else could do the work, but because everyone believed I should. My father's version of concern came packaged as pressure. Just get us through this quarter, he'd say. Things will calm down after the next contract. Calm was always scheduled for later. When I mentioned the doctor's advice, my mother looked worried for a moment, then said what she always did. The family is counting on you. It wasn't framed as a demand, it was framed as love. And love, in this family, meant endurance. I learned how to function in fragments. I slept in short bursts. I ate standing up. I answered emails in hospital waiting rooms, in parking lots, in line at the pharmacy. My master's graduation ceremony came and went in a blur. I remember sitting in the audience, cap on my head, phone buzzing with work messages I didn't answer until the dean stopped speaking. When my name was called, my parents clapped. My father smiled for the photos. On the drive home, he took a call from a client and put it on speaker. We talked business the entire way back. No one asked how I felt. I didn't know how to answer if they had. Looking back, the warning signs were obvious. The constant pain. The way I jumped at every notification. The quiet resentment that crept in whenever someone said, "We couldn't do this without you," and still expected me to prove it again tomorrow. But at the time, I interpreted all of it as the cost of being needed. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. That families leaned on their strongest members. That one day, when things were finally secure, I'd get my life back. The trap wasn't the work. It was the belief that the work would eventually buy me rest, respect, and recognition. Every time I felt myself reaching a limit, someone reminded me of my role. The reliable one. The capable one. The daughter who could handle it. So, I pushed past the pain, past the exhaustion, past the quiet voice telling me something was wrong. I kept going because stopping felt like letting everyone down. And because deep down, I was still waiting for the moment someone would look at everything I'd given and say it had been worth it. After my master's graduation, something inside me shifted not in a dramatic, triumphant way, but quietly, like a door that had finally closed behind me. I didn't feel proud so much as finished. Finished pretending that endurance was the same as loyalty. Finished believing that if I just proved myself one more time, things would balance out. I waited a few weeks before saying anything. Letting the company ride the post-graduation high of another successful quarter, letting myself recover just enough to think clearly. Then, I did what I'd been rehearsing in my head for years. I prepared a case. Not an emotional appeal, a business one. I treated it the way I treated everything else at Thomson Logistics methodically. I pulled salary benchmarks for operations directors and COOs in the event logistics industry across the Southeast. I calculated my average weekly hours over 4 years, including weekends and holidays. I listed KPIs we'd improved: on-time delivery rates, reduced penalties, equipment loss down to near zero, safety incidents cut in half. I highlighted the long-term contracts I'd helped secure and the revenue growth that followed. I even included a retention plan, outlining how stabilizing leadership compensation reduced turnover and protected institutional knowledge. It wasn't flashy. It was factual. The kind of presentation I'd expect any executive to respect. The morning I went into my father's office, I was calm in a way that surprised me. He was sitting behind his desk, laptop open, scrolling through emails like I'd asked him about lunch instead of my career. I waited until he finished typing before I spoke. "Do you have a few minutes?" I asked. He waved a hand without looking up. I started the way I always did, with respect. I thanked him for the opportunities I'd had, for trusting me with responsibility. Then I explained why I wanted to talk about my compensation, how my role had evolved, how my responsibilities now aligned with positions that paid significantly more in the market. He leaned back in his chair and sighed, the way people do when they think they're about to educate someone. "Maya," he said, "you're lucky to have this job." The words landed exactly where I'd always feared they would. He talked about family, about how working for your own blood was a privilege. He reminded me that I'd learned the business here, that I'd gained experience money couldn't buy. "You're still young," he added. "Outside this company, it's brutal. People don't look out for you. Here, you're protected." I listened without interrupting, even as my hands tightened around the folder in my lap. When he finished, I slid my presentation across the desk. I pointed to the numbers. I explained, calmly, how my compensation lagged far behind industry standards despite my responsibilities. I showed him the hours, the contracts, the margins. I wasn't asking to be rewarded for being his daughter. I was asking to be paid for the job I was doing. For a moment, he was quiet. I thought maybe, finally, he was considering it. Then his tone changed. "You're thinking about this all wrong," he said. "You're treating this like some corporate negotiation. This is family." He dismissed the benchmarks as irrelevant. He called my degree, extra education, I'd chosen to pursue. "I didn't ask you to do that," he said, as if I hadn't been applying what I learned every single day. When I pointed out that the company directly benefited from that education, he waved it off. "That's part of learning," he said. "You should be grateful." The word snapped something inside me, not because it was cruel, but because it was final. Grateful meant silent. Grateful meant compliant. Grateful meant knowing your place. I tried one last time. I told him I wasn't threatening to leave. I told him I wanted to build something sustainable, for myself and for the company. I told him I was exhausted, that the workload wasn't sustainable long term. He cut me off. "If you're not happy," he said, "you're free to see what else is out there." He said it lightly, like a challenge he didn't think I'd accept. "Go find another job if you think you're worth more. The market will tell you." It wasn't advice, it was a dare. And beneath it, a warning: don't forget who holds the power here. I gathered my papers slowly. I didn't argue. There was nothing left to say. As I stood up, he was already back to his emails, the conversation over in his mind. I walked out of his office and down the familiar hallway, past desks and schedules and systems I'd built, feeling a strange clarity settle in. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a timing issue. It wasn't something that would be fixed after the next quarter or the next contract. This was the answer. I stepped outside into the parking lot and sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I felt empty and then, slowly, certain. The door I'd been pushing against for years hadn't just stayed closed, it had been locked from the inside. And for the first time, I understood that no amount of work, no degree, no sacrifice was ever going to open it. 2 days after that conversation, my father sent out a company-wide email calling for an all-hands meeting in the warehouse. The subject line was cheerful, almost celebratory, exciting updates for the future of Thompson Logistics. We rarely did all-hands meetings unless something major was happening, so people buzzed with speculation. New contracts, maybe. Expansion. A new location. I stood near the back with the operations team, already uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. The conversation in my father's office was still echoing in my head, unresolved, hanging in the air like humidity before a storm. He stood on a pallet like a makeshift stage, hands clasped, smiling the smile he used with clients. He talked about growth, about how far we'd come, about the importance of evolving leadership as the company scaled. People nodded. Some clapped at the right moments. Then he gestured toward the entrance. And my sister Bree walked in like she'd stepped out of a completely different world. She was dressed in a tailored blazer, heels clicking on concrete, hair perfectly styled. She hugged my father, took the microphone and launched into a speech filled with phrases that sounded impressive but said almost nothing, redefining our brand experience, elevating the client journey, bringing fresh perspective to growth. I watched faces around me shift from polite attention to confusion. The crews didn't know what she was talking about. Neither did I. My father beamed as he announced her title, Director of Client Experience and Growth. He spoke about innovation, about how her background made her uniquely qualified to take us to the next level. People applauded, because that's what you do in those moments. I stood there, feeling my chest tighten, my mind oddly calm. This wasn't the shock yet. The shock came later, in the quiet. After the meeting, while people broke off into small groups whispering questions they didn't want to ask out loud, I followed my father back toward his office. I closed the door behind us and asked the question I already knew the answer to. What's her salary? He didn't look at me at first. He shuffled some papers, straightened a stack that didn't need straightening. That's not something you need to worry about, he said. I reminded him, evenly, that I handled operational budgets. That compensation affected overhead. He sighed, the same sigh he'd used in our conversation days earlier, like I was being difficult on purpose. She's starting at 3 times what you make, he said finally. Plus a company car and phone. Her role requires flexibility. I laughed, once, quietly, because the alternative was saying something I couldn't take back. He frowned. Don't do that, he warned. I asked him how this made sense after our conversation. After everything I'd presented, he didn't hesitate. This is exactly what I was talking about, he said. Your attitude. You don't show gratitude. Bree brings energy. She understands people. You're good at execution. But leadership is more than numbers. Then he said the sentence that sealed it for me. You're not ready for more because you don't appreciate what you already have. In that moment, the last illusion fell away. This wasn't about strategy. It wasn't about growth. It was discipline. A reminder of hierarchy. I'd asked for fair compensation, so he'd shown me exactly how replaceable I was in his eyes. I walked out of his office and back onto the warehouse floor, past people who wouldn't meet my eyes because they sensed something had shifted. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt exposed, like the private reality I'd been living in had just been made public without my consent. I went back to my desk and sat there for a long time, staring at the screen. Emails came in. Questions about schedules, a vendor asking for confirmation. The company kept moving, because it always did, and because I was still there to move it. That's when I understood what this meeting had really been. It wasn't just an announcement, it was a test. Would I swallow it and keep going? Would I accept being diminished and still show up the next morning at 4 a.m.? I didn't storm out. I didn't raise my voice. I finished the day. I answered the last email. I locked my office and drove home in silence. That night, I opened my laptop and drafted my resignation letter. It was calm, professional. 2 weeks' notice. Offer to assist with transition. No accusations. No explanations. I read it twice before saving it. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. The meeting hadn't humiliated me in front of others. It had clarified something for me alone. By elevating my sister and tripling her pay, my father had told me everything I needed to know, not just about how he valued my work, but about how he saw me. Useful, but interchangeable. Loyal, but not worth investing in. The trap I'd been living in finally snapped shut, and in doing so, showed me the way out. I wasn't leaving in anger. I was leaving because staying meant agreeing with a story about myself that I no longer believed. I sent my resignation email the next morning before the warehouse came fully alive. It was addressed to my father, HR, and myself, written in the same tone I used for vendor contracts and client escalations: clear, calm, impossible to misread. 2 weeks' notice. Willingness to document processes. Availability to assist with a structured transition. No emotion. No blame. I hit send and sat there for a moment, waiting for the familiar rush of anxiety that usually followed any decision that disrupted the family balance. It didn't come. Instead, there was a strange stillness. Like the moment after you finally set down something heavy and realize your hands are free. The fallout came quickly anyway. My mother called first. She didn't yell, she cried. She asked how I could do this to the family, how my father was supposed to manage, how people would talk. I told her I wasn't doing anything to anyone. I was leaving a job. She said that wasn't how it worked when it was family. When my father called later, his voice was tight with anger rather than grief. He accused me of being dramatic, of overreacting, of throwing away my future. "You'll regret this," he said. "You think the outside world is kinder?" Bree texted me that afternoon. "Don't be childish," she wrote. "Dad's just trying to grow the company. You're making everything harder than it needs to be." I didn't reply. I was done explaining myself to people who had already decided what my role was supposed to be. I went back to work and did exactly what I said I would do. I documented workflows. I updated system permissions. I created handover notes detailed enough that someone who'd never run a show could at least understand how not to break one. I trained people who asked and answered questions without sarcasm. I didn't sabotage anything. I didn't slow down. If anything, I was more precise than ever. Part of me wanted to leave things perfect out of habit. Another part wanted the record to be clear. Whatever happened after I walked out the door would not be because I left a mess behind. That's when the conversations started. Not formal meetings, quiet ones. Caleb was first. He caught up to me near the dispatch board one afternoon, waited until no one else was within earshot. Caleb had been with the company almost as long as I had. He knew every route, every driver's limits, every shortcut that didn't show up on a map. "I heard you're leaving," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact. I nodded. He was quiet for a moment, staring at the screen where routes were updating in real time. "No one else understands this system the way you do," he said finally. "You built it so it actually works." I told him the documentation would help. He shook his head. "Documentation isn't judgment," he said. "If you go, I don't know how long I stay." Monica came next, a few days later, closing the door to my office with the kind of care people use when they're about to say something they haven't fully decided yet. Monica managed our key accounts, the clients who didn't just pay invoices, but trusted us with their reputations. She had a way of remembering details that mattered, not because they were written down, but because they were human. She didn't ask me why I was leaving. She told me she understood. "They don't call the company," she said. "They call me. And they trust me because I tell them the truth." She paused, then added, "They trust you because you make sure I can." She didn't say she was quitting. She didn't need to. The implications sat between us, heavy and honest. Jorge was the hardest conversation. He ran on-site crews, the people who showed up before dawn and stayed until everything was perfect or as close to perfect as the day allowed. Jorge cared deeply about his team, about safety, about fairness. He'd never said much about family politics, but I'd seen the way his jaw tightened during the all-hands meeting when Bree was announced. He found me in the warehouse during a late check-in and asked if the rumors were true. When I said yes, he let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a while. "They listen to you," he said. "Because you listen to them. If you're gone, people are going to think twice about staying." He didn't ask me to take him with me. He didn't pledge loyalty. He just stated a reality I already knew. None of them said they were leaving because of me. They said they were reconsidering because the company no longer made sense, because the systems they relied on were being undermined, because decisions were being made by people who didn't understand the consequences. Their words didn't feel like a victory, they felt like responsibility. I made it clear to all of them that I wasn't recruiting anyone, that whatever choices they made had to be theirs. I wasn't building an exit strategy. I was simply stepping out of the way and letting the truth show itself. At home, the pressure intensified. My mother asked me to reconsider, for everyone's sake. My father stopped pretending this was about my happiness and started framing it as betrayal. Bree sent another message, longer this time, talking about family unity and how I was embarrassing them. I read it once and deleted it. I couldn't afford to carry their narratives with me anymore. Every time I felt the pull to justify myself, I remembered the meeting in the warehouse, the way my work had been erased with a title and a paycheck that tripled my own. I remembered how clearly that moment had spoken. As my final week approached, the atmosphere in the company shifted. People were polite, but cautious. Questions that used to come straight to me hesitated, bounced around, then landed awkwardly in places they didn't belong. I could feel the systems straining, not because they were failing yet, but because the people who held them together were starting to imagine life elsewhere. That wasn't leverage I'd engineered. It was the natural result of clarity. On my last day, I packed my things into a small box. A notebook, a mug, the binder where I'd once written down every process before they lived in software. I walked through the warehouse one last time, saying goodbye, without speeches or promises. When I handed in my badge, my father didn't come out of his office. That was fine. I wasn't looking for closure from him. I'd already given myself what I needed. As I drove away, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. I had made a decision based on truth instead of fear. And for the first time in years, the weight I'd been carrying wasn't on my shoulders alone. It was out in the open, where everyone else could finally see it. I didn't take time to grieve my exit. I didn't have the luxury of it, and honestly, I didn't trust myself to sit still long enough for doubt to creep back in. 2 days after my last day at Thomson Logistics, I updated my resume for the first time in years. It felt strange to write down things I'd been doing quietly for so long, to frame my work in language that made sense to people who had never seen me race a sunrise or calm a panicked client at midnight. I sent applications to a handful of established event logistics companies across Raleigh, Atlanta, and Charlotte, places big enough to understand scale and professional enough to value systems over last names. The responses came faster than I expected. Within a week, my calendar filled with calls and video interviews. Some were polite and generic. Others were sharper, more curious. They asked detailed questions about routing, inventory controls, and risk management during high-profile events. They didn't ask why I'd left my family's company. They asked what I'd built there. That difference mattered more than I'd anticipated. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't being evaluated as someone's daughter. I was being evaluated as an operator. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon. The number was from North Carolina, unfamiliar but local. The man on the other end introduced himself as the COO of Blue Peak Event Freight, a regional heavyweight with annual revenue hovering between 35 and 50 million. I'd applied online like everyone else, but his tone suggested this wasn't a routine screening. "We've been watching Thomson Logistics for a few years," he said. From the outside, something shifted. Routes got tighter. Complaints dropped. Contracts stabilized. People in the industry kept saying the same thing, that someone inside had their hands on the wheel. He paused, then added, "That someone was you." I felt my throat tighten, not with pride, but with relief. He wasn't flattering me. He was naming my work. We talked for over an hour. About how I'd scaled systems without burning out crews. About how I balanced client expectations with operational reality. About mistakes I'd made and what they'd taught me. When the call ended, he didn't ask if I was interested. He told me they were. 2 days later, they sent an offer. The number alone made me stare at the screen longer than I'd like to admit. The base salary was 45% higher than what I'd been making. On top of that, there were performance bonuses, a 401k with matching, comprehensive health coverage, and actual paid time off written into the contract, encouraged, not treated like a weakness. The role allowed hybrid planning, meaning I wouldn't have to live on site to prove my commitment. The benefits weren't extravagant. They were respectful. They said, "We expect you to work hard, and we expect you to be human." I accepted the offer without negotiating theatrics. I didn't need to posture. The validation was already there. Signing that contract felt less like a victory and more like alignment my skills, finally meeting an environment built to support them. When I gave Blue Peak my start date, the COO asked one more question. "Do you work alone?" he said. I told him the truth. That no system survives on one person. That there were people I trusted, people who understood the work the way I did. He nodded. "If they're open to talking," he said. "We are too." I didn't orchestrate anything. I didn't make promises. I simply answered honestly when Caleb and Monica reached out separately, asking where I was landing. I told them the name of the company and nothing more. Within weeks, both were invited to interview. Blue Peak didn't poach recklessly. They vetted. They asked the same kinds of questions they'd asked me. How did you make decisions under pressure? How did you manage trust with crews and clients? Jorge was offered a conversation as well, but he declined at first, saying he wasn't ready. Even so, the message was clear. The market wasn't just recognizing me. It was recognizing the network of competence that had been quietly holding Thomson Logistics together. As I settled into my new role, the difference was immediate. My calendar had structure. My weekends existed again. When I raised concerns, people listened without framing it as ingratitude. No one reminded me how lucky I was to be there. They assumed I belonged because the evidence said I did. That quiet respect changed something in me. It softened the edge I'd been carrying for years. I didn't celebrate publicly. I didn't post updates or send messages back home. But in private, I let myself acknowledge what this moment meant. The market had answered the question my father had thrown at me like a dare. I didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. The work spoke. And it spoke loudly enough that others had been listening all along. I didn't hear about the collapse all at once. It came to me in fragments, carried on the same informal networks that had once kept Thomson Logistics running smoothly. A text from a former crew lead. A quiet phone call from a vendor I still trusted. A casual comment from someone in the industry who didn't realize how close to the situation I'd been. From the outside, it probably looked sudden. From the inside, it was the predictable result of replacing substance with appearance. Bree moved fast once I was gone. Too fast. Her first big initiative was a brand refresh, something she framed as necessary to modernize the company's image. New logo. New color palette. New client-facing language. Thousands of dollars paid to a designer friend who'd never set foot in a warehouse or a loading dock. The problem wasn't the branding itself. It was the timing and the priorities. While money went into visuals, maintenance budgets were quietly tightened. Training sessions were postponed. Systems that required discipline were labeled rigid and replaced with looser, more aesthetic workflows that looked good in presentations and failed under pressure. She also changed how projects were sold. Bree loved deadlines. She loved the way clients reacted when she promised speed and flexibility. She didn't understand that every promise echoed through a chain of trucks, crews, permits, and equipment availability. She quoted aggressive timelines without checking capacity. She approved overlapping jobs because, on paper, they fit. In reality, they didn't. Trucks were double-booked. Crews were stretched thin. Equipment that should have been reserved was already miles away on another site. The people who raised concerns were told to be more solution-oriented. Tenor days. The breaking point came during a large medical conference at the convention center, the kind of event Thomson Logistics had once handled with confidence. It was a multi-day setup with strict timelines, sensitive equipment, and no margin for error. Bree promised the client an accelerated install to secure the contract, brushing off internal warnings as pessimism. On setup day, the cracks widened into something impossible to ignore. Key lighting rigs were missing. Booth components arrived incomplete. A truck scheduled to deliver backup equipment was still 2 hours away because it had been rerouted for another job at the last minute. Crews worked frantically, overtime piling up, tempers flaring. By the time the doors opened, sections of the exhibit floor were still unfinished. The client was furious. Penalties were enforced. Lawyers were mentioned. A contract that had once been a crown jewel turned into a liability overnight. Word spread quickly in a community that thrives on reliability. I heard that my father showed up on site personally, trying to take control, but he didn't recognize the systems anymore. The digital scheduling he'd once resisted had been altered. The inventory controls were only partially enforced. The institutional knowledge that made quick decisions possible was gone. He reverted to old habits, phone calls, gut calls, favors, none of which could fix a problem rooted in structure. Around the same time, Monica left. She didn't make an announcement. She simply gave notice and took a position elsewhere. With her went several accounts that had stayed loyal not to the logo, but to the people who delivered on promises. I started getting calls then. Not angry ones. Confused ones. Clients who recognized my voice and asked, carefully, where I'd gone. Whether I was involved with the company anymore. Whether the rumors were true. I answered honestly, without disparaging anyone. I told them I'd moved on. Some wished me well. Some sounded disappointed in a way that had nothing to do with me. Inside Thomson Logistics, the pressure intensified. Overtime skyrocketed as fewer experienced hands tried to cover more ground. Crews burned out and started leaving, one resignation at a time. Online reviews shifted in tone, then in volume. Complaints about delays and miscommunication replaced the quiet praise that had once filled comment sections. Vendors tightened terms. Cash flow wobbled under the weight of penalties and rushed expenses. The company that had once run on predictability was now reacting to crises it couldn't anticipate. I didn't feel satisfaction watching it happen. Mostly, I felt a dull sadness for the people still inside, the ones who showed up early and stayed late because they believed in the work. But there was also a strange clarity. Nothing that was happening was mysterious. When you dismantle systems and elevate people who don't understand their consequences, failure isn't dramatic, it's procedural. My father, I heard, was working longer hours than he had in years, trying to plug gaps with effort instead of structure. Bree's confidence reportedly faded as the applause stopped and the questions became harder. The company wasn't collapsing because I left. It was collapsing because the reality I'd been holding together was finally visible without me there to absorb the impact. From my desk at Blue Peak, the contrast was stark. Problems existed here too, but they were named and addressed, not smoothed over with slogans. Each time I heard another update from my former company, it reinforced something I was only just beginning to accept. What I'd built had been real. What replaced it was not. And reality, eventually, always collects its debt. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another vendor or a wrong extension. When I answered, there was a pause on the other end, the kind that tells you someone is choosing their words carefully. Then my father spoke. His voice sounded different, lower, less certain. He didn't start with accusations. He didn't start with anger. "Maya," he said, "things are complicated right now. We could really use your help, just for a few months. For the family." He talked about stabilizing operations, about clients getting nervous, about how no one knew the systems the way I did. He framed it as a temporary favor, a bridge until things settled down. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked one question: in what capacity? There was relief in his voice, as if that alone meant I was already agreeing. He said we could talk details later. I told him there would be no later without clarity now. I explained, calmly, that if I were to be involved at all, it would be as an external consultant. Hourly contract. Market rate. Defined scope. And Bree would not have authority over operations while I was there. The silence that followed was immediate and sharp. "You're making demands," he snapped. "After everything we've done for you." I didn't raise my voice. "No," I said. "I'm defining boundaries." That's when the anger surfaced. He accused me of being ungrateful, of abandoning the company when it needed me most, of threatening him when he was already under pressure. He said family didn't charge family. I told him family also didn't exploit labor and call it loyalty. "I'm not threatening you," I said. "I'm valuing my work. There's a difference." He hung up without answering. My mother called later that evening. Her approach was softer, but no less heavy. She talked about the employees, about how scared people were, about how layoffs were being discussed. She said my father was aging. That stress was affecting his health. She asked how I could live with myself knowing people might lose their jobs because I refused to help. I felt the old pull then, the reflex to absorb blame and fix what wasn't mine to fix. It passed. "They're losing their jobs because of decisions you and Dad made," I said. "Not because I left." She cried. I stayed quiet. When she asked if that was really my final answer, I said yes. The second confrontation came a week later, in person. My parents asked to meet for coffee, neutral ground, no shouting. I agreed, mostly to be sure I'd said everything I needed to say. My father slid a document across the table before we'd even ordered. It was a letter of intent, vague but pointed, outlining my return to the company in a leadership role that answered, indirectly, to Bree. He framed it as compromise, as family unity. He said it would show client stability. I read it carefully, then pushed it back toward him. "I won't sign this," I said. "And I won't come back under these terms." He accused me of pride, of letting ego get in the way of forgiveness. I told him forgiveness didn't require self-erasure. When I stood up to leave, my hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. I walked out without waiting for a response, without looking back. The consequences unfolded quickly after that. Without intervention, the company continued to unravel. Clients demanded concessions. Lawyers circled. The bank tightened credit lines and required new guarantees. My father worked himself into exhaustion, trying to hold things together with effort instead of structure. Bree's role quietly diminished, though no one admitted it out loud. I heard about it the way I heard everything now secondhand, stripped of emotion. I didn't feel victorious. I felt resolved. I had offered help on terms that respected my labor and my limits. They had refused. The fallout was painful, but it was honest. For the first time, I wasn't cushioning anyone from the consequences of their own choices. And that, I realized, was the hardest boundary to hold and the most necessary. 12 to 18 months after I walked away, my life no longer felt like something I was constantly running from. The change didn't arrive all at once, and it certainly didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, in the form of sleep that lasted through the night, weekends that stayed intact, and mornings where my phone didn't dictate my mood before I even got out of bed. At Blue Peak, paid time off wasn't a theoretical benefit buried in a handbook. It was expected, used, respected. The first time my manager told me to log off and take a Friday because I looked tired, I didn't know how to respond. I sat there for a moment, waiting for the catch. There wasn't one. I started therapy not because I was broken, but because I was tired of carrying patterns I hadn't chosen. I learned how deeply my sense of worth had been tied to being useful, how easily I mistook responsibility for love. Slowly, I began to untangle the belief that if I didn't step in, everything would fall apart and that it would somehow be my fault. I paid down my student loans without panic. I cooked dinners at home. I said no without rehearsing explanations. The space I'd created by leaving didn't fill with guilt the way I'd feared. It filled with clarity. At work, the recognition I'd once chased stopped feeling like oxygen and started feeling like feedback. I was promoted to regional operations within the year, given a team that trusted me not because I sacrificed myself, but because I built systems that let them do their jobs well. I delegated, I mentored. I left the office when the day was done. No one questioned my commitment because it was visible in results, not exhaustion. For the first time, my competence wasn't something I had to defend. I heard about Thompson Logistics the way you hear about an old neighborhood you no longer live in. With familiarity, but from a distance. The company didn't disappear. It couldn't. Too many people depended on it. But it did change. Faced with mounting debt and tightened credit, my father agreed to a merger that stripped him of control while keeping the doors open. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined. Bree moved on to another role in another industry, still searching, still convinced the right environment would unlock her potential. I didn't take satisfaction in any of it. Mostly, I thought about the employees I'd worked alongside for years, and I hoped the new structure gave them the stability they deserved. There were moments when guilt tried to resurface, usually triggered by a memory or a stray update. In those moments, I reminded myself of something my therapist had said early on: you are not obligated to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Compassion doesn't require self-destruction. Responsibility doesn't mean erasure. I had offered help in a way that honored my labor and my limits. It had been refused. That was the end of my responsibility, even if it wasn't the end of the story. I didn't cut my family out of my life entirely. I simply stopped negotiating my worth with them. Conversations became shorter, safer, less charged. I no longer chased apologies or understanding. I didn't need them to validate my choices for those choices to be right. The distance wasn't punishment, it was protection. If there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that family is not supposed to be the place where you disappear. Gratitude is not meant to be a leash. And boundaries are not acts of betrayal, they're acts of self-respect. Walking away didn't make me heartless, it made me whole. So, I'll leave you with the question that stayed with me long after the dust settled. If you were in my place, if you knew that going back would mean losing yourself again, would you return to save something that never truly valued you? And if you're listening to this right now, where are you, and what time is it there?